Well, I think you're right. We as men, we tend to be conquest driven. If you ask a man what he does, typically he'll show you his business card or he'll tell you what he does. And so we get our affirmation by what we do. If you talk to a woman, she would tell you more who she is because they're more relationship oriented. So it doesn't really mean we love our wives less. We tend to say, okay, I've got that. We tend to think, what's next? And we forget we need to keep dating our wives and having that relationship with our wives. And so it's sort of an unintentional thing. But every marriage, either we find ourselves drifting apart, which is natural because we take each other for granted, which is sort of unintentional, or we intentionally working toward oneness. And so we have to really be intentional in that relationship. So we need to keep working in a relationship after we're married as much as hard as we worked to get here before we got married.
It's true. We do put a lot of work in the beginning, and then it's
Yeah.
like, okay, we have the prize. Do we just put it on a shelf like a trophy? Welcome to The Climb, where I help Christian men live fully, lead boldly, and leave a legacy that matters. I'm your host, Teko Bailey, husband, father, life coach, and your guide in the climb. Whether you're navigating fatherhood, building a business, or simply longing to live more purpose, this is a space to rise. Today we have Dr. Clarence Shuler with us, otherwise known as the Love Doctor. Dr. Shuler, tell me a little bit about that. What is it that you do that makes them call you the Love Doctor?
Well, one of my board members years ago gave me that name. And he gave me that name because he said, you go to people's houses. Sometimes I do marriage intensives. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who had affairs in their marriages. And God's given us a very high success rate, sort of like a blueprint. And so I'll go spend time with them, and God will save their marriage. He said, man, you're the love doctor because you make house calls. And
Come on.
so it just kind of stuck. And so, so people hear that name, they don't usually forget that. But it's really helping people learn how to have a better marriage relationship. And sometimes I do it in diversity and just different areas for singles as well. But that's how I got the title and kind of just stuck.
I like that. You're also the author of several books, and one of them is Keeping Your Wife Your Best Friend, which pushes against the idea that marriage just survives on duty. Why do so many men unintentionally drift from friendship with their wife?
Well, I think you're right. We as men, we tend to be conquest driven. If you ask a man what he does, typically he'll show you his business card or he'll tell you what he does. And so we get our affirmation by what we do. If you talk to a woman, she would tell you more who she is because they're more relationship oriented. So it doesn't really mean we love our wives less. We tend to say, okay, I've got that. We tend to think, what's next? And we forget we need to keep dating our wives and having that relationship with our wives. And so it's sort of an unintentional thing. But every marriage, either we find ourselves drifting apart, which is natural because we take each other for granted, which is sort of unintentional, or we intentionally working toward oneness. And so we have to really be intentional in that relationship. So we need to keep working in a relationship after we're married as much as hard as we worked to get here before we got married.
It's true. We do put a lot of work in the beginning, and then it's
Yeah.
like, okay, we have the prize. Do we just put it on a shelf like a trophy? you know?
Well, we do. I mean, some people call themselves trophy wives. I mean, some guys
Yeah.
do go and find the prettiest girl they can, say, well, I've got her. She becomes a trophy wife, and then they go doing whatever they do. And that's not the way God intended. So we do have to be careful. We work real hard to pursue her, to catch her, to get her to like us and fall in love with us. But God says like we need to keep on doing that. And a lot of times, to be fair to men, we typically don't have a mentor to help us teach us how to be good husbands.
It reminds me of one of the things John Maxwell says, what gets you there doesn't necessarily keep you there.
That's
And
true.
so I think sometimes, we do all the work and we say, oh, now I'm married. And, we think it's going to keep us. And that's when the work just starts. Before we jump into that, What inspired you to invest in this area of life, helping people and seeing them grow in their marriages and relationships?
Well, I think just from my own marriage, I was influenced by Dr. Gary Chapman, the author of the Five Love Languages. So he led me to Christ and discipled me. And so, but then just being married, I married a great woman. Her name's Brenda, and we had a really pretty good relationship. But I wanted more. I think, in our third year of marriage. I think we started drifting apart, not knowing that was kind of happening. And so we went to a family life weekend to remember. And to be honest, I was trying to get her fixed. I said the problem must be her, not me. But then when I got there, I really got convicted by the speakers, and they were so transparent, and they were sharing their mistakes. And I kind of thought, man, I'm making those same mistakes. And so it was just really helpful to have someone to do that. And then after that, at the same time, I was pastoring a church. It was a cross-cultural church, a young church, and we were discipling people. And I was so impacted by that marriage conference that every year when it started coming, I got usually half our church to go. And it lowered my counseling rate tremendously, but people just got turned on by going to a marriage conference. Even in a lot of churches, a lot of times pastors don't preach about marriage, and we don't hear about that, so we don't know what to do. And so I was just really blessed, one, to have Gary Chapman in my life, and then to get exposed to this family life weekend to remember. And then after we started doing that, we actually started doing our own marriage seminars that we've been doing probably for about 40 years in the US and overseas as well.
Uh, Dr. Schuler, what inspired you to invest in this area of helping people to grow in their relationship and in their marriages?
Well, the thing it's really my own marriage. I think we were doing okay, but I wanted our marriage to be better than okay. And I happened to hear about this marriage conference called Family Life Weekend to Remember. And so I took my wife and we both went. She agreed to go. And, I always joke with her, but I was thinking, if we're having a problem, it must be her. It can't be me. And
Yeah.
so we went to the conference. And I was really convicted by the guy speakers who were very transparent. And as they shared the mistakes they were making, I sat in the audience and said, I'm making these same mistakes. One thing good about that, it helped me realize I was normal, I wasn't crazy, but also there was hope. And so I
Yeah.
learned more about how to communicate. It was a really great conference. At the end, we wrote a love letter to each other. That was really cool. And so that was a big deal. And at the time, I was a pastor. So the very next year, we usually for the next few years, at least about half my church went to that Weekend to Remember conference, and it really dramatically lowered my marriage counseling, which was great. But it's just a really good gift. Having been led to Christ by Gary Chapman, author of the Five Love Languages, that was just really helpful as well. So I've always had a passion for marriages. Mine is not perfect, but we try and work at it really hard. And we just try and share people kind of what we're doing well, and we even share what we're struggling with, and people tend to resonate with that. And we do that in the U.S. This past summer we were in Ghana. This year in 26 we're scheduled to go to South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. And so our goal is to share the gospel and share marriage, wherever we can.
I love that. I think marriage is the core of, the family unit. And if we're not doing well in that area, then naturally our families won't do well. I think also anybody who has an influencer like Dr. Gary Chapman has learned a thing or two, even beyond just the five love languages. But those are such good fundamental principles to practice in any relationship within or outside of marriage. In the state of where our society is today, how can we help men navigate the area of marriage better? Because sometimes some of us are from broken homes, we've never seen it modeled. We hear all of these stories, but especially in the church, we see biblical stuff, we hear biblical teachings, but then there's a wrestle between what we see happening in society and what we're hearing in the church. And I think there's a struggle between the two. How do we help men really navigate some of the crux of these challenges and experiences?
Well, a couple of things. To be really honest with you, a lot of times the church is not a safe place for guys to go. I mean, I think I want guys to go to church. So hear me. I'm not saying we shouldn't go to church, but the church is really geared more toward women than men. That's why back in the mid 90s, the ministry of Promise Keeper just blew up in the United States because they were speaking a language men related to. I have found that we have to create a safe place where men feel safe. that they can do that. And I think it'd be great if our pastors led out with that. But a lot of pastoral marriages are struggling too. And so pastors don't want to be hypocrites. So if they're struggling in marriage, they're not going to preach about marriage. But it really hurts the church, not just those who are able to get married, but it hurts our young people need to hear it, elementary school on up, about marriage and dating and some principles. So what I found out is that building one-on-one relationships are really important. But people are so desperate. When I'm on an airplane, you sit beside somebody and they say, "What do you do?" And I just say, "Well, I'm the love doctor. I help people with
Yeah.
relationships." Everybody turns around,
Come
flight
on.
attendants, everybody, and we start having this conversation. You would not believe how people say, "I wish I met you 2 years ago." Or people say, "I'm doing this." I was swimming in the pool, and our sauna in our club overlooks the pool, and so I went into the sauna just to chill out. And the guy commented on my swimming, but then he said, "I read this book, The Five Love Languages." I said, "Well, I know
Yeah.
that guy." And then he starts saying, "Hey, I'm struggling in my marriage." Now the sauna is packed with men
Yeah.
and women, right? And he says, "Well," I said, "Well, what's going on with your wife?" He said, "Well, she said I don't listen to her." And I said, "Well, for some people, when their spouse listens to them, they interpret it as being loved. They say, 'You
Mm.
care enough to hear me.' And so that's why she's responding." I said, and so people were like freaking out. One woman said, "I need them to take notes, but I'm sweating in here." And then one lady said, "You're not going to charge me for this therapy session." But we just went into it, and I just started sharing some biblical principles. Result of that, this one girl shared her whole life with me. She'd been married, divorced, and Brenda and I did a conference in the same state. She actually drove to that conference, brought a friend, and
Wow.
referred some people for me to do marriage counseling with. Other people in there who were secular, one guy wants to hire me to do some stuff for his organization. I mean,
Come
he didn't
on.
even know Jesus, but he said the principle was so important because he's an HR person.
Yeah.
And the number one problem people struggle at work a lot of times is their marriages. And divorces are expensive for businesses. So I think we have to look for opportunities. We have to create safe place for men to talk one-on-one about marriage. Some men's group do a great job, but a lot of times, I don't know about in Canada, but in the US, the older men's group guys who are about my age, they beat men up, and men are tired of being beat up. So and they elevate women. And so guys struggle with that. And they say, "Well, where can I go?" And most guys want to be better husbands. They just don't know
Yeah.
how, or there's not, no one's telling them how to do it. So that's why I wrote my book, Keep Your Wife Your Best Friend. It's truth in it, it's humor. I mean, I've had wives come up to me and say, "What did you put in that book? My husband won't share it with me." And then some guys, they read it with their wives, and there are questions at the end of every chapter so they can actually becomes a Bible study. But I think we have to be creative and look for ways. But I would ask my pastor if I'm going to a church and I like my pastor, I like the church. I say, "Pastor, could you preach about marriage, maybe a couple times a year? Here's
Yeah.
an area I'm struggling with." And I talked to a bunch of guys, they're struggling with it too. So could you preach about how to be a good husband? Could you preach about how wives, maybe you and your wife could talk about how to be good wives? And so I think people aren't doing that. But when people say, "Where's a good church to go?" I say, if you're a pastor and preaching on about marriage somewhere between 4 and 6 times a year, there are 52 Sundays. I said, I would find a church where they're talking about marriage.
Come on.
In fact, we actually grew our church cross culturally in Tulsa, Oklahoma years ago, kind of talking about marriage. And everybody, marriage doesn't discriminate. And so we had all these different people, black, white, a few First Nation people came to the church, rich, poor, because they wanted to be better in their marriages. And that was kind of the hall trademark for our church.
I think it's important that church do create this safe space, and the more we understand what people are looking for, is the better that we can meet some of their needs. Uh, Keeping your wife your best friend. In the book, you talked a little bit about listening emotionally, and maybe there's some of the blind spots that men have, which oftentimes we're not aware of. Tell me a little bit more about that. How can we be more intentional to listen in that way? Because I do, even my friends, I do hear a lot of them saying, similar situation where their wives or the women in their lives don't believe or think that we're really listening. And when in fact, I think we're really trying hard, but for whatever reasons. And even our kids in different ways could say a similar thing. We're like, "Dad, I said this to you, but you weren't quite listening." What are these blind spots that's holding us back?
Well, we don't have to be a magician. We don't have to just mind read. I think it's, if your wife says, "I don't think you're listening to me," just ask her a question. Well, what makes you think, what does it look like for you when you think I am listening? So I can hit that target. Or if we're having a conversation, you think I'm not listening, say, this is an example to me that you're not listening. But you give her permission to tell you. And you do the same
Yeah.
with her. And so I think it's also important that you look at the person when you're talking to them, when they're talking to you. And I think when they're talking to you, say, let's have some guidelines because some people can talk forever. And you say, well, share three important things to me that happened today, and not what happened, but how you felt about it. And that builds
Yeah.
intimacy. And so, but I would ask her, say, tell me why you think I'm not listening, and what's it like to you when you think I am listening, so I can hit that target. And so I always deal with couples because we don't know, and they know in their mind, but we don't know. And so when
Yes.
some women say, I really need security, well, what does that mean? Does that mean paying the bills on time? Does it mean locking the door? I mean, what does security mean to you? So that way we know exactly, and we're not trying to guess. And with your kids, I say the same thing. I'll say, why do you think I'm not listening? Or what makes you feel like I'm really giving you my attention and listening? And some kids say, well, you're looking right at me. Well, you're not multitasking, but you're looking right at me when I'm talking to you. Then I think you're listening to me. Or for some people, when you're asking clarifying questions, you know. So I think those are a few little things you can do when you're trying to listen. If you go to my website, I have a free video series. It's just my name, ClarenceShuler.com. There's no C in my last name because we were poor. We weren't poor, we were poor. But anyway, if you go there, it's called Common Mistakes Most Couples Make. And there are videos that are 3 to 5 minutes you can go listen to. And we actually have one on communication. I think we call it Are You Hearing What I'm Saying? And it has
Mm.
a husband and wife trying to have communication. And I actually come on stage and help them to communicate with each other, make sure they're hearing each other. Because
Yes.
sometimes couples talk at each other, they're not listening to each other.
No, that's good. Those are some key nuggets that I think every relationship will benefit from if we start practicing them. I want to segue a little bit into leadership at home versus control because I think sometimes as men we confuse leadership with control and it messes up relationships and sometimes or maybe not sometimes there are times when we're aware of it and there are times when I think we're very intentional about it. How can we bridge the gap or help men to do better in this area because again what we see is what we do.
Well, that's true. And sometimes when we try and control our wives, we are actually fighting our insecurity because we don't really know how to lead, and we're trying to earn that. And I think real good leadership is about being a servant leader.
Yes.
In college, first school I went to, which I loved my coach on my last year, we scored almost 100 points a game. This for a 3-point shot. And we ran up and down the floor. I was a shooting guard. We didn't have point guards. And when I got the ball, I had permission to shoot, so I shot. I didn't see a
Come on.
shot I didn't like. But when I transferred to another school, the guy said, you can be a point guard. I said, well, what's that? And he said, the big men, to get the ball off the board, they'll give it to you on the defensive end of the floor. You'll take it to the other end and you'll pass it somebody score. I said, well, when did
Mm.
I shoot? He said, you're the fifth option. I said, drag. But here's the deal, and I had to sit the bench for a year to learn how to be a point guard. But a point guard's job is to make everybody else around them better. And so if I'm gonna be a really good husband and a good father,
Mm.
my goal is to serve everybody, become a student of my kids and my wife, and to make everything about them better. I don't forget about myself, but I put them first. And so I think it's important we learn to do that. One thing that's helped me, I've had some really great mentors in my life, some older men who've been married for a long time, but not just married a long time, but actually had good marriages. One of my basketball buddies, I met him in '75, and I got to have his dad as my mentor for 23 years. My dad was killed when I was 20, so I didn't have that role model when I was trying to become a man to figure out how to do that. But my dad did set a pattern for me and how he loved my mom, how he kissed her, how he was affectionate, how he was faithful to her. All those things really helped me. But I think having an older guy really helps. Think of your headship not as a dictator, but think of your
Yeah.
headship as a servant. And when you serve and make everybody better, they're naturally want to reciprocate, but also when you're serving people, it makes them want to follow you. It makes it easier to follow. And I think the other thing is ask questions. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to guess and read people's minds, but just ask a question. I mean, it might take some courage, but sometimes Brenda used to do this a lot early in our marriage. I would ask, how am I doing? How are we doing? Or we would counsel a couple together, and when they leave, we'd ask each other, okay, well, how are we doing with this? Or
Yeah.
periodically, I'd ask my girls, I'll say, how am I doing as dad? And they would say, well, it hurts when you spank me. I said, well, I mean for that to hurt, but other than that,
Yeah.
how am I doing? And sometimes they would say, Dad, I think you're too hard, or sometimes. And I would
Yeah.
listen. I said, well, wait, give me an example of being too hard. And so again, they would give me a target so I could serve them better, but I was listening.
Mm.
And the thing that my girls said blessed them the most, my girls are now adults. The thing they told me that blessed them the most was the fact I would admit when I was wrong and I would apologize. And I think that was really big because I was a pastor and all stuff like that. And so to tell them, hey, I'm sorry, I'm wrong, will you forgive me? That was huge. And it made us that made me approachable to them too.
You've talked a lot about mentorship.
Mhm.
How can men find good mentors when it seems as if we live in such an isolated world, and oftentimes we want to do, or we seem to like to do life on our own? Why is it so prolific today? How can we break out of that to find mentors?
Well, I think one of the things I think in the US, homelessness is an epidemic. And it's an epidemic we're not going to recover from. I think it's really important that I'm kind of one of those guys that, one of my best buddies, his grandma's a great cook. When we were growing up in the black community, at least where I'm from in North Carolina, when you went to somebody's house and they said you want something to eat, you always said no. Your parents told you to say no. You don't ever ask anything to eat. I'm not
That's
sure
right.
why, but I was with one of my buddies and his grandma could burn. I mean, she could cook. And so
Come
she had all
on.
these desserts, in the kitchen. And he just finished eating dinner and he says, so you want something to eat? You want some dessert? And I said, no. He says, so your mouth said no, but your eyes say yes. And I just learned from him. I just learned from him that if I want something, I ask for it. And
Yes.
so if my dad, who's a Christian, being no longer around, when I see an older godly man that I think's a good man, um, I will ask that man to mentor me. And so, but then people tell me it's unusual to ask someone to mentor you, but I tend to do that. And so I look for them. If I hear about them having a good marriage, if I hear about their kids, and the guy who did me, not only his kids Christians, but his grandkids were Christians. And I say, this guy must
Yes.
be doing something right.
Come
And so
on.
I look, and then here's the other thing. I haven't met a young guy that didn't want somebody to mentor them. And I haven't met an old guy who wouldn't be honored to have a younger guy to mentor. But older guys think young people don't want anything to do with them, and younger people think old guys don't want anything to do with them. That's not the case. When I served in a church, there's actually a mega church, and I introduced younger men. I had a breakfast every Tuesday morning, and older men together. Revival broke out in the church because these young guys found these older guys to mentor them because their
Wow.
dads might be in a different state or dads might not be around or the granddads. And it was just incredible. And the older guys who were successful, a lot of them retired military, they had plenty of bucks. So when I need something to do in the ministry, they would just fund it. My church budget would say, y'all had this much. I go ask them, and so I think I would encourage guys, if you see a guy who you think's a good man, look how he treats his wife. Look how his
Yeah.
wife responds to him. And if you see that's something good, I would, pray about asking that guy, hey, would you mentor me? But then it's your responsibility to tell the guy, because a lot of older mentors will say, well, what does that look like for you? And then you need to have some idea what you're looking for, even though you don't have all the answers, for somebody to mentor you as well. I mean, I always do it when a guy said, I want you to mentor me. I say, well, what does that look like for you? What does that mean? And one guy gave me some description. I said, no, I said, you want a life coach. You're not looking for a mentor. I said, you need to pay me for doing that. I said, I can't meet you every week, 2 hours early. And I
Come
said, I
on.
can't do that. I said,
Eh,
but I can do this. I
Yeah.
can meet you once a week, maybe, or really better once every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so you really sit what you can do and what they can do. And it's just, but when I have these mentors, one thing that helped me is that it made me become a little bored for a little bit. I was free of my responsibility of parenting, being a husband. I was just a little kid sitting at their feet for an hour, hour and a half while they spoke wisdom into me. And it was just, man, it's so encouraging. Then after that hour, hour and a half, I'd jump in my car, go home, and I was a better husband, better dad. And so I would tell guys to look for that. It's out there. The other thing, pray about it. Ask God to send you some godly men to talk to. And I actually had before I got married, I had an older woman who mentored me. And I would go to her house, her husband would be there, her two kids. I would be in the kitchen, with her talking. And when I wrote my sermons, I'd write my sermon on her kitchen table. She said, how can you write a sermon with all this noise? I said, that's the way it was at home. And but I could come to her house anytime unannounced, go straight to the refrigerator and cover refrigerator privileges. And so,
Come on.
I just think you just ask people, and He'll provide that for you, and it's been invaluable.
I think these are some very good principles to practice. What would you say if a guy is struggling with father wounds where he's a bit hesitant or fearful to kind of step out in that area? And it's not so much that he wouldn't want to, but there are wounds that's preventing him from doing that.
Well, father wounds are real. Um, I think a couple things I do. If whether the father is alive or not, I encourage people. I encourage men to write a letter to their dad and just tell them wherever unedited, write this letter. Everything you want to tell your dad, you never told him that you want to tell him. I do that.
Yeah.
And then I take that letter. Then I take that letter. Once I say everything, I pray about it. Emotionally, I pray about, say, God, and then I'd write it, and I'd take that letter, tear it up, throw it in the trash. And then I'd write another letter that I could actually give my dad, that in writing a way that he could receive it.
Hmm.
Not short, I wouldn't say sugarcoating the things that I may think he has done, or say, God, Dad, why'd you do this, this, and this? Because a lot of times we don't know why our dads did certain things. There's a great book. It's called I Don't Want to Talk About It by Terrence Real. He is not a Christian, but it's a great book. And he had this really negative thing about his dad because his dad left them. But years later, he ran back into his dad and they had a conversation. His dad told him why he left, and it wasn't his fault at all. But when we tend to leave, our kids tend to think we desert them. So I would do that. The second thing I would do, if your dad is passed, is deceased, then I write that letter, a second letter to him, and dedicate it to God. And then the other thing you have to do, once you write the letter that your dad, you can actually give your dad, and he can read it, then and then if your dad's passed, I would forgive your dad. You
Yeah.
have to forgive your dad. And then,
Yeah.
and you may have to give your dad what you want first, what you want from them. And
Hmm.
you have to realize your grandfather may have never told your dad he loved him.
Yes.
And so your dad may have never told you he loves you, even though he did or does. And so you might need to say, Dad, I love you. And his first response would be, mm-hmm. Or it might be, I love you. Very few will say, I love you too. Or they might say, me too. But after a
Yeah.
while, you'd be consistent. Eventually, they would do that. So you may have to train your dad how to say, I love you. Not he doesn't want to do it. But
Yeah.
see, as a man in his generation, they didn't talk about it. They were told not to share emotions, so to try and do it is difficult. But if their grandfather wasn't loving on them, then they didn't have a model how to be loving on you. But I think you need to forgive your dad because when we don't forgive, that unforgiveness permeates every relationship we have with our kids, our wife, everything. And we don't even know it subconsciously does that. So forgiving your dad is the first step towards your own emotional healing. So keep that in mind.
I think that's very deep. As you've said, we don't always know some of the challenges or experiences our fathers have been through, and sometimes it breaks or erodes relationships or harden places in their lives, which really should have been, tender areas to invest in your family, and they had to do whatever they needed to do to protect themselves and that part of them to keep moving forward in life. And so sometimes subconsciously, it's just like, I'm not going to do this. But then you don't realize your kid's going to need that thing from you. And
And they have no idea. They have no idea how much their dad, their kids need them because men have been marginalized, particularly men of color. And so we don't know that we have this value of being a dad. And so unless someone tells you that, then you don't see it. But when I'm counseling people, almost the first question I ask is, tell me about your relationship with your dad. Tell me everything I need to know about them.
I'm going to segue a little bit into your book, Choose Greatness. You speak
Okay.
directly to young men about decisions that shape their future. Looking back, what's one of those decisions you wish more young men understood, kind of the long-term impact before it's too late?
Well, one would be I'll never forget. I was 14 years old. I was not a Christian. I was with my friends who had in our schools, all black school, and prep schools like Philip Exeter, and I can't remember the other name. They came recruiting us, and so I was number 8 as far as intelligence or highest ranking academic in the school. They only took the first 7, and so but 2 of my buddies were chosen, and they went to prep school. And when they came back, we get always get together and talk. So we're in my buddy's room. His parents were very wealthy. They owned a bus line because back then they had a white bus line, black bus line. So they owned the black bus line. So we're in his house, and he and his cousin who went to prep school, they were talking to us about drugs. And they could get drugs for free. And they were doing LSD and stuff like that. And something in my heart says, plus they were also, there's a war on drugs. And so the commercials in the US were like, just say no, which are really
Yeah.
powerful. And you know, and they were giving us drugs are right there. And they say, you want some? And I love my friends. We played basketball together. And I finally said, no. I said, I'm not going to take the drugs. And I was a follower at that point in time. I was not a leader. And I walked out and they said, okay, it's cool. And I walked out and I left early and I walked home. You know, I live about 2 miles away. And so, but I felt really good about myself that didn't do the drugs. And later on, the drugs messed some of them up. Some did okay. Didn't really, I don't know. But that was my first transition from going from being just a follower to doing what's best for me being a leader. But I honestly, actually, I was scared to do drugs. I mean, the commercials were scary. They say, "Will drugs turn you on? Really turn on you?" So that was a real big deal. And we still remain good friends, but that was a real big deal.
It, it takes a lot of guts, especially when you're around friends, to not go along with the flow, you know? What are some of the key principles you would want people to know from this book, Choose Greatness? Whether it's for, I know it's written to men, but even for the women who are part of the lives of these men, what would the message be that you want people to know and why they should even pick up this book?
Well, you want to teach your young men and young women what we call self-worth, not self-worship, but self-worth.
Yeah,
And so that means you have value. And so you don't want to do drugs because drugs can diminish your value. And we teach them how to make good decisions about education. There are a couple of chapters in about how to treat a woman. And we'd also talk about sex. The book is pretty gender neutral except for those two chapters because I actually spoke at an event, all daughter event. There were 1,800 people there and this book sold out. It was really important that all young boys and young men want to hear their dad's stories. When they go through this
yes,
book, Choose Greatness, they hear their dad's stories when they were their age. And when we don't know our dad's stories, we grow up and we have gaps and we don't know why we are the way we are. In fact, when there's fatherlessness, some boys, teenagers get angry because they don't have someone to teach them how to work on a car or do different things. Of course, now cars are computerized, you can't really work on them. But back in the day, you could do that. Are there certain skills your dad would teach you? And
yeah,
we miss that. And so the book just really helps you make decisions. It talks about how to make diversity, uh, friends from who don't look like you. It talks about education, importance of education, and how to impact your salary. And we talk about how if you have a high school diploma, you'll make this much money, a college degree, you make this much money, other degrees. So you can actually have influence on your destiny. And if you want to have a family, how you can provide for them. And there's a bunch of illustrations in the book that I think are really, really important. And we, in the last chapter, is what do you think about God? And so we give you a very opportunity to explain who God is. But I think it's really important for young people. We want young people, especially somewhere between 10 and 18, to be able to make wise decisions when, let's say, someone like you as a dad, you're not around, you want your boys to make good decisions. And my
yes.
dad instilled in me how to make good decisions when you wasn't around because I didn't, you know, and I know people don't agree with that, and I'm not telling anybody to do that, but in my day, my dad spanked me. He only spanked me 3 times, each time if I was going to die. But I didn't want to get, I didn't want my dad to spank me. So that was a big
Yeah.
deterrent. And probably my dad probably saved my life because I was pretty wild, but I knew if I messed up, there were consequences to pay, and I didn't want to pay those consequences. So I was really grateful to my dad that he was a disciplinarian. And you don't have to spank everybody's kids. I mean, I need it, but kids who aren't disciplined some kind of way, was a timeout or whatever. They didn't have timeouts when I was growing up, but um, they feel loved. And the kids who are not disciplined don't feel loved. And so the Choose Greatness really teaches them how to have self value, how to have self worth, and really the importance of having a dad or a substitute dad in that process. So that's what the book really does. So they can make these really good decisions because between 10 and 18, you're not thinking 5 years down the road. And the book helps you to think long term. It's fun playing checkers, but we try and get everybody playing chess. You know, you
Yeah.
need to think 3 or 4 moves down the road that can really impact your life and making wise choices. And a lot of times those wise choices need to be made when you're young, 16, 18, or even younger.
I think these choices prepares you, you know, whether it's manhood for manhood or fatherhood in the later stages, and you touched quite a bit on the area of fatherhood. What are your thoughts on AI, in the sense that it's filling a lot of space relationally because there's so many broken relationships, especially between fathers and sons or fathers and children. My main question is, if AI is filling those spaces where dads would naturally do, and if we're already not doing a good job of it, what can we do to kind of preserve that space?
Well, fathers have to make the mothers a priority and then the children priority after that, and in that order, because that gives a child security. How their mothers are treated gives children security. And children need to hear from us. They need to hear us tell their mothers we love them. And they also need to hear us say we love them, our children. That gives them security. Um, when dads aren't around, one of the reasons we had gangs were so big in the United States because they were filling a gap for dads, and the gangs, good or bad, became families for those guys, and they would do anything for the family. And I found out when we talk about a dad, when I go to prisons to speak about share the gospel, those guys would do anything to have a dad. Even the guy they wish they could have had a dad, they would do anything. So it's huge. So, and I can't tell you the guys who I'm mentoring who I try not to fill in their dad gap, but some of the guys have dads who aren't Christians, or some have dads who are Christians but who aren't spending that time with them, and then some guys don't have dads at all. And so AI is really good, but we need to make sure we're using AI and the AI is not using us. It's just like having money. Money's good; it's not necessarily evil, but we need to make sure we're managing our money and our money's not managing us. And so I think that's what we need to make sure we're in control. And I think with AI, I always tell people, um, it needs to be your voice. It needs to be you. It can make good suggestions when you aren't locked in. But a lot
Yeah.
of kids are going to AI to substitute for dad, and AI is not necessarily Christian, so they can get a lot of bad advice. I mean, they could put in what would a Christian dad say, and maybe they get more help. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I think when we're dependent on something that's artificial,
Yeah.
I think we get in trouble. And so I would look for the real deal. There's some things you can't really substitute, and having a real mentor or dad is something you can't substitute for. Not with something artificial.
Absolutely. Dr. Schuler, this has been a very powerful conversation packed with lots of gold and key principles that I think will bring transformation to anybody's life, and especially in a man's life. What words of encouragement do you have to give to the man who is listening to this but not sure what is the first step to take? And let me be specific about who this man is. He's maybe just married or having his first child, and kind of in that those early years of life and parenting, but still trying to figure out even himself. How do you encourage him to move forward? What's one or two first steps to take if he feels stuck in the midst of all of this?
Well, I would ask for help. It's not. It doesn't make you less of a man to ask for help. I would look to who I'm asking help from. I would look to see who's seemed to have raised their child, and their children seem to be doing really well. And maybe these kids are 4 or 5 or 6 or 10, and I've got just a month old, and I'm looking for direction. How did you get them here? I would maybe ask that question. I would ask my family if I have a good family. That if my dad's still alive and he's a good dad, I would ask him. Those are questions. I think it's something that you and your wife can do together. If you're Christians, I would pray together. Say, hey, how can we raise our kids together? What do you think? These are my thoughts. What do you think? And I would even encourage them to write, have a parenting mission statement. These are the kind of parents we want to be for our kids, and you can always keep tweaking it, but it gives you a goal and direction as to where you want to do and results you want to see your kids have. And
Yeah,
also, it gets away from the gray stuff. It gets into black and white, and when it gets into black and white, you get more clarity. If we want our kids to be smart, what do they say is important to raise a smart child? What's involved? Some people say listening to opera music at night helps your kid become smart in regards to the math and all stuff like that. Well, if that works, then maybe we'll have our kids listen to, soft, opera music. Who knows? I would ask around. I would ask grandparents. Grandparents have tremendous wisdom. And I just think
absolutely.
we need to look at the legacy of our grandparents and great grandparents and see what we can learn from our own family. But I would learn there are a lot of books on parenting, Christian books. So I would look and see what we need to read and talk. But I think doing something's better than doing nothing. The kids want to stay small for a certain amount of time, and our influence is greater the younger they are than when they get older. The older our kids get, the smarter we become. So I think it's really important that we do that. And so when they're at the when they're 10, 12, 13, 14 and try and make decisions, then they would kind of lean toward what mom and dad said.
Words of wisdom. If people want to find you, how do they do that? And are there any projects or events coming up that people should know about?
Well, we're doing a couple marriage events in I think Albuquerque, February, I think starting that weekend, first weekend, I think it's February 6th, maybe through the 8th, something like that. Uh, we're in Hilton Head the following weekend, and then we're in Sacramento after that. But they can also go to my name. This is Clarence, not Clearance, but it's clarenceshuler.com.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of free stuff on there, a lot of free videos. They can go and do that. Or if they want to get the common mistakes most couples make, they can go there. And also on my website, it has all my books. Or you can go to Amazon, just look up my last name, Shuler, and find me, and you can get some of the books that deal with the marriage we talked about, keeping your wife your best friend, or they can find a book, Choose Greatness. And there are a lot of other books that are there as well. So
excellent.
that's where they can get in touch with me. They can go to my website, just clarenceshuler.com, and they can actually email me from the website. And if they do that, I'll respond as soon as I can.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on the climb.
Well, Teko, thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be with you. You're a really sharp guy, and when I grow up, I want to be more like you.
Thank you.